Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Simon Riesen. I am Senior Solutions Manager for DAM Cellular Systems, and during the next 20 minutes, I would like to share with you some of the newest developments in mobile communications for railway usage. Before we start, let's have a look at the history of mobile communications. When you look back 20 years ago, typical GSM base station looked actually very similar to a Tetra base station. These deployments were typically somewhere in the cellar, or if they were outside, they were in these kind of shelters with relatively high mass. So the idea was to build redundancy locally and to build as high mass as possible in order to build a network with as few base stations as possible. Now, when we look at modern commercial mobile networks like 4G or nowadays even 5G networks, you see that there is a clear trend towards outdoor base stations. So what you see here on the picture is actually the antenna up there, and then the small boxes down there are actually the radio heads, the base stations for LTE or 5G. And this tendency is very strong, and there are also good reasons for it, because you can imagine the site costs are much less if we just need to have some place on the mast instead of having a complete container to put all your things. The same applies actually also for masts. So you see rather many small base stations covering areas instead of one extremely high mast, because building high masts is also a relatively expensive experience. And the third point I would like to discuss with you is actually also the redundancy. Redundancies are typically built or have been built in a way that all elements in here are duplicated in these base stations. But when you go to mobile networks, typically they are not redundant anymore in commercial networks, because the redundancy is built through so-called cell overlap. So that means if a unit fails, then the service can be provided by an adjacent site. Interesting now is that when you look at typical Tetra networks, even nowadays, 20 years later, they are mostly still deployed in a similar way. And the key reason for this is, of course, that the market pressure for PMR networks is not that high, because the numbers are lower. We are not talking about millions of users, we talk rather of about thousands of users. Nevertheless, DAM Cellular Systems has been one of the pioneers in introducing outdoor base stations to the market. What you see here is our BS422 base station. It is actually more than a base station. It is a complete system that includes, beside the base station, also the whole switching infrastructure. It is a software-defined radio, and saying that, it means that it can accommodate several carriers on one single transceiver. So actually up to 4 carriers, either Tetra or DMR, can be powered by one single box. And the box is relatively small. It's something like 30-40 centimeters high. So, and with that size, you can easily install it almost anywhere. So you can put it outside. It is highly robust, but also you can put it in a tunnel or whatever. So the space requirement is actually very, very low. And then there is one special feature which I would like to discuss with you a little bit in more detail during these remaining 15 minutes. It's the so-called frequency sharing. This is a unique feature on the DAM Tetra base station, or also on NMR, DMR base stations. So the point is that you can reuse the same frequency in the adjacent base station. So it's basically repeating the signal to the adjacent base station. This brings basically 3 use cases or 3 main advantages. So first of all, in rail, where you have a typically low density network, it will increase your frequency efficiency because you do not need so many frequency pairs to build your network. And another main use case for rail would be that you can actually build repeater systems with this unit. We will just have a look at these use cases in more detail. And geo-redundancy is actually just a special case of the above two. So we will also have a look at this one. So when we have a look at how tunnel coverage has been built over decades now for PMR networks, it has remained the same almost all the time. So you build it in a way that you have a base station, and in order to save money, you do not want to put too many base stations into the tunnel because you have a relatively low density network typically. So that means you will use optical repeater systems consisting of master and slave units. And then the master unit is basically translating your RF signal into optical signal, bringing it to the repeaters, and they will then actually repeat the signal to into the tunnel. The drawback of this system is that this is relatively a complex setup. So you end up actually with managing your tetra network, and then you also need to manage your repeater network. And last but not least, you will end up actually with lots of spare parts you need, because if you manage your network, of course, you also need to make sure that in case a unit fails, that you have a spare part available. Now, when doing this with the BS422, you can actually build the network in a significantly easier way. So what you see here on the right side is in practice the same what you see on the left side, but much better and much higher reliable. So why I just try to explain to you. So first of all, when I say that it is better, so from RF performance point of view, this one here, these are all exactly the same hardware units. So even if they are configured to be master and slave or master and repeater, they receive the signal with the same sensitivity as any base station. So the sensitivity you get here of a BS422 is 10 to 20 dB better than what you get out of a repeater, because any kind of repeater system will always degrade your signal along the path. And then, as you have seen before here, the left side, this is actually a relatively complex system. So if you use the BS422, you have a unified system with one network management. You can actually manage your base station and also your repeater, your slave unit. You will have only one single spare part to build the whole network. And last but not least, when it comes to resilience of the whole system, so if now this master unit here fails, the BS422, any of these slaves can take over, and you will just only lose coverage in that limited area, but you can build cell overlaps, so you will actually always have coverage. But in this case here, if the master unit or even if the base station here would fail, then actually none of these repeaters will work anymore. So the robustness, the resilience is much higher in that system. But let's have a look at another use case. Another common use case is actually when you would like to build coverage on elevated railway lines, so above ground. And what you see here is actually just symbolizes these F1 to F5 symbolized covered areas of a tetra network. And the blue dotted line symbolizes the area where you cannot reuse frequency 1 anymore because of interference constraints. So that means if you want to build a railway line, a long railway line, you will need to have 5 frequencies, even though you have only very, very few users in the network. So even though it's a low density network. Now, if you use frequency sharing, you can actually use for 4 base stations in a row, you can use exactly the same frequency. You will have a little bit lower capacity, but for low density network, this is not an issue. And this blue dotted line, the size of this blue dotted line is the same as before. But what you see now here, when you go with the second frequency, you will actually be able to reuse frequency 1 after the 5th base stations again. So that means in this example, instead of 5 frequency pairs, you will only need 2 frequency pairs. So, and in terms of operating the network, this will significantly save costs for you. So let's now have a look at what that means when you build your network. Once again, going back how traditional railway networks, this symbolizes maybe a metro network, what you see here, where you have kind of metro stations relatively close to each other. And the idea in the traditional approach is that you build a highly reliable base station with a high tower, and you would like to cover as long area, as wide area as somehow possible. And then in between, in order to build the coverage in the station, wherever it is needed, you will have some off-air repeater or other repeater systems to do it. Now, the dumb approach works in a way that you build your network by using just a single non-redundant base station, but you put it actually at every station, which are maybe 3 or 5 kilometers apart from each other. And the idea here is that you can build the network with lower towers, and the covered area of one single base station is actually not so far as you see in this traditional approach, but it reaches at least to the next station. So that means you will have double coverage everywhere along the line, wherever you are. So that means if you are now a user of the network and you travel from left to right side, in the traditional approach, the field strength will actually change quite much. So we have very strong field strength here in the close to antenna. It will decrease, and then it will make some handover on the other side. So, and here the average field strength along the line, since you have always overlapping coverage, it is actually much more evenly distributed. So the quality of your network will be significantly better. Then one additional major advantage of this is also in case of a failure. Of course, this base station here, since it is fully redundant, the probability that it fails is extremely low because you have all the units are duplicated. But let's think of some force majeure, some flooding or fire or whatever that would destroy the whole site. If the whole radio site is out of operation, you will lose coverage, and actually you will also use coverage in the area that use the repeaters. In this approach here, even if this base station is out of operation, you will still have coverage because you have double coverage in all areas. So the mobiles that are now in this area, they will register either to the base station on the left or to the right side. And last but not least, I would like to mention here that a big advantage is also that you can actually use part of the radiated power to directly feed a distributed antenna system from this base station here. So as you see in the lower approach, there is no need for any kind of repeaters. So again, it simplifies the network. You can manage with lower masts because here, if you have more base stations, you will also not need as much as high masts as in the other approach. So let's start summarizing of the advantages of this approach. So the idea is to build a coverage with lower towers, and if you can mount the base station very close to a tower, which is not the case in an indoor base station, you will actually receive better receiver sensitivity in the uplink. You will have very evenly distributed signal strength, and also, I did not mention that before, if you use lower towers, especially in urban environment, you will cause actually less interference. The radio planning is much more simple. You will have higher availability because building geo-redundancy with a base station, it is significantly superior to a local redundant base station, and especially it also protects against these cases of force majeure if you have some fire on a site, for example. Software-defined radios will not have any combiner system. A combiner system is a single point of failure of any indoor base station. Frequency sharing will offer you the possibilities to share frequencies in adjacent sites, so you can build your low-density network with less frequency pairs. You will not need any repeaters if you use more base stations, but just simple base stations that are not redundant. You can feed directly a distributed antenna systems to your indoor area, and actually the same applies also for underground. So you can use leaky feeders, and you can build the redundancy by feed the leaky feeders from both ends. And again, I mentioned it when we discussed the repeater, so there will be a unified management for a repeater and tetra network, so it will save you costs in the long term, and also that you will need to maintain a lower sized spare part stock. And last but not least, this is maybe the most important part, it will significantly reduce your costs. So first of all, the costs of the sites themselves, because the base station as such is small, there is no air conditioning needed, and then also since you have no feeder losses, in order to have the same power at the antenna, you can actually run the base station with less power because there are no feeder losses. So, and less power means also less power consumption. So this will all help you to save money. And then at the end, of course, also lower towers. It's much cheaper to build 2 low towers instead of 1 high tower. Right, and again, the same what I said in the beginning. So this is fully in line with the main trends in the mobile telecommunications. So you go from indoor to outdoor installations, building geo-redundancy instead of local redundancy, and then you have also lower towers with more base stations. Yeah, thank you for your attention. I hope you had interesting 20 minutes and learned something new. So in case you would like to know more about dumb cellular systems and their products, please contact your local dumb partner or go to dumbcellular.com, or of course you can always contact me per email. So thanks again for your attention, and goodbye.